Good afternoon. Greetings from the Nanovic Institute for European Studies here at the University of Notre Dame. My name is Clemens Sedmark and I serve as director of this institute, which has been established to build bridges between our university and Europe. Our newly inaugurated university president, Father Bob Dowd, has mentioned bridge building as a fundamental aspect of his vision for the University of Notre Dame. Bridge building is a key calling of our Nanovic Institute. The connection to Ukraine is of particular importance to us. We have a special bridge built between Notre Dame and Ukraine, particularly the Ukrainian Catholic University, with its president, Archbishop Boris Gudziak, and its rector, Taras Stopko, who just happened to be on campus last week for the inauguration festivities. A few weeks ago, our president emeritus, Father John Jenkins, was awarded an honorary degree in Lviv on the campus of Ukrainian Catholic University. We want to build bridges through friendships, encounters, and exchanges, but also through the flow of knowledge, insights, and information. Today's virtual flash panel is an opportunity to better understand the current situation in and development of Ukraine. Welcome to our flash panel, Ukraine Today. Where is the country heading? We are approaching 1,000 days of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. On February 24, 2022, Ukraine, a sovereign country, was attacked in an unprovoked war, violating the basic standards of international law. Since then, we have seen destruction and killing, war crimes, unspeakable cruelty, but also bravery, resistance, resilience, and solidarity with Ukraine. Where is the country heading? In June, The Nation magazine published an article on new polling in Ukraine showing significant Ukrainian support for diplomacy to end the war. In the same month, an International Peace Summit, formerly called the Summit on Peace in Ukraine, was held in Switzerland. In August 2024, Ukraine's army, in a surprise incursion, moved into Russian territory in the region of Kursk. In the same month, Ukraine has adopted a law to ban religious groups linked to Moscow in a move targeting the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, a move criticized by many, including Pope Francis. In September, Russia intensified airstrikes against Ukraine. Just last week, President Biden held talks with Ukraine Prime Minister Starmer over Ukraine missiles. And also just last week, the Washington Post published an article entitled, "Ukraine is bleeding out, it cannot fight forever." Ukraine, where is the country heading? Our distinguished panel will explore this question. We have 5 panelists, 3 of whom are based in Ukraine. I will very briefly introduce them in the order of their inputs. Olya Voroshbet is a journalist, affiliated expert with the Foreign Policy Council Ukrainian Prism, visiting lecturer at the Ukrainian Catholic University, and deputy editor-in-chief of the newspaper Ukrainian Week. Welcome, Olya. Thank you so much for joining us from Ukraine.
Thank you, Clemens.
Rachel Rosenberg graduated from Notre Dame's MGA program in International Peace Studies in 2022 and works in Ukraine as deputy head of partnerships and donor management with the Halo Trust, a humanitarian non-government organization which primarily works to clear landmines and other explosive devices left behind by conflicts. Welcome back to Notre Dame, Rachel. Thank you for joining us from Ukraine.
Thank you.
Taras Sovtenko is acting executive director of Ilko Kocherev Democratic Initiatives Foundation, one of the oldest and influential Ukrainian independent think tanks. He's a security expert and will present expertise on the military aspects of the current situation in Ukraine. Welcome, Taras. Thank you so much for joining us from Ukraine.
Thank you very much. My huge pleasure.
Mary Ellen O'Connell is a wonderful and impressive colleague here from Notre Dame, where she serves as Robert M. Marion Short Professor of Law at our law school and as Professor of International Peace Studies at the Kroc Institute. Mary Ellen is a leading expert on international law, international legal theory, and the international law on the use of force. Welcome, Mary Ellen. Thank you so much for joining us. Volodymyr Turchinovsky is Dean of the Social Sciences Faculty at the Ukrainian Catholic University and our fall 2024 visiting scholar here at the Nanovic Institute. He's a dear friend and colleague, trained as a philosopher, and has served in his university's leadership for many years. Welcome, Volodymyr. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Welcome all. This is the choreography. Each panelist will offer her or his insights for 5 to 7 5 to 7 minutes, and then we'll have time for some questions and comments. Please send us, dear audience, your questions via the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. We will end on time after 1 hour, since we want to respect people's busy schedules. So again, welcome all, and please, Olya, if I could give the floor to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Clemens. And, while thinking about today's discussion, I was recollecting our discussion, our interview 2 years ago. This was also an autumn of 2022. It was a difficult autumn for Ukraine, also as the next one in 2023. And the autumn, which started just 16 days ago, is not easy at all. Already we can say that we had the deadliest Russian missile attack since the full-scale invasion, which happened on the 3rd of September. Also, Russia attacked my native city and the city from where I'm speaking, Lviv, just a week ago, killing 7 people and 60 people were wounded. This was also a very personal attack, as one of the strikes was just in front of my mother's house and the street where I grew up. And that event, it influenced the thinking and what I prepared and what I would like to stress today during the discussion. So when the attack happened, so the whole street was with broken, so windows were broken, but there was a cafe of my school friend, and at that cafe, so it could not work at that day because the doors were broken. But already on the next day, it came back to work, and that is it started working again, and that is about Ukraine. This is about resilience we still have. During our interview and discussion 2 years ago, you were stressing that the part which we have in Ukraine, the advantage we have, is high morale and motivation. And nowadays I listen and also read a lot of publications, also in the Western press, that we have less of this morale now, especially among the military and the soldiers. Well, having in mind 2 years of the full-scale invasion, this is true. But still, you see, with all the attacks we face, we have the resilience to come back to normal life. And that is, I would say, one of the main things I would like to stress. The other thing is that Ukrainians, over these almost 1,000 days of full-scale invasion, did not give up building the society where we live and investing in the resilience of the society. I see my friends who are joining the civil service, though we lack civil servants. And this is very important point apart from the military now. So all these things show that Ukraine is developing and that it stresses and it invests in its resilience. But what we need is courage. No, courage not of the Ukrainian people, because you see we have it. We need the courage of the Ukrainian partners. In August, a lot of people in the West were stricken by the news of the Kursk offensive, and it proved that Ukraine is ready for asymmetric moves to fight Russia, and we can win. Nowadays, we have lots of discussions on possible negotiations. So these the Kursk counteroffensive shows that Ukraine can win without having these negotiations now. But for winning, we need courage of the partners. And courage of the partners means now, for example, the ability to strike back Russia, with long-range missile, with long-range artillery missiles and rockets. And this is very important. So Ukraine as people and as a society, it's more difficult to live, and in comparison, yes, to the first year of full-scale invasion, probably there are maybe people are more tired. But at the same time, the resilience is still here. The courage is still here. What Ukraine needs is more support and more courage of its partners. Thank you.
Olya, thank you so much. The war is very close. It's personal for so many, including yourself, sadly. You mentioned the courage in order to keep up not only the resilience of the Ukrainians, but the courage on the side of the partners. And I'm sure Mary Ellen will have something to say about that. Thank you, Olya. Rachel, thank you for your input. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Professor Sedmak. Thank you, everyone. Afternoon from Ternopil. I'm very honored to be participating in this panel alongside such esteemed fellow speakers. I am speaking to you, as I said, from Ternopil, but I'm usually based in Brovary, which is a suburb of Kyiv, where I work for the Halo Trust, the world's largest humanitarian demining charity. I just wanted to say up front that I'm not representing Halo today, just speaking from my own personal perspective. But since arriving here in January, I've had the privilege to travel around our area of operations, which is primarily focused on eastern and southern Ukraine, where most of the landmine presence is. And I've had the privilege to meet members of local communities who are unable to farm their land, who are unable to let their children play outside or safely gather firewood to keep warm during the winter because of the threat of mines and other explosive remnants of war. And I've gotten to know some of our deminers who themselves, many of them have been displaced multiple times since 2014 by this conflict and have lost family members. And they're now working every day wearing heavy visors, Kevlar vests, swinging a metal detector, and excavating the earth manually to search for mines, using their fingertips to feel in the grass for nearly invisible tripwires that may be hidden there. And earlier this year, I had the chance to visit a completely abandoned village in southern Ukraine called Bezimenne, which means nameless, in Mykolaiv Oblast. It's been shelled countless times and it's heavily mined. And when I was there the day I visited, it was actually less than a week after someone had detonated a mine and lost part of his leg. So that's the reality in which we're operating here. I have three main points that actually some of them intersect with what Olga has just said. One on the sort of shorter term logistical and security challenges that many organizations like Halo, but others as well are facing. One more looking at the macro level midterm challenges of funding and the viability of keeping up this response. And then one more about the personal challenges that people involved in the response are facing as people. So first, the attacks, some of which Olga already alluded to, that occurred especially in August and September that struck a lot of critical infrastructure has further compounded a lot of the challenges that humanitarian organizations are already facing going into this coming winter. It was a very hot summer. We faced a lot of issues with power cuts, the risk of heat stroke for field-based staff. And now we're looking at a winter that's likely to be much harsher than last year, which was comparatively mild. And so it's very important for organizations to be prepared, to be stocked up on generators, power banks they can issue to staff to be able to maintain communications in the field, good winter uniform to keep people warm, and lots of contingency plans to ensure that we can have continuous operations and activities. And in the last few months, a number of NGOs, offices, and hotels and hostels where they typically accommodate their staff have also been hit in some of these attacks. So the need to find new solutions to accommodation also compounds this logistical security problem that's very complex and puts a lot of pressure on organizations to be able to respond quickly to the changing context. Secondly, I would raise the issue of funding. So organizations generally, we all anticipate that almost inevitably traditional mechanisms for funding for the humanitarian response in Ukraine is plateauing and is going to continue to drop in the face of multiple concurrent challenges that are competing for attention. So this is already beginning to happen. And I think it's also worth highlighting that the UN sector coordination bodies are now conducting the OCHA-led humanitarian program cycle needs assessment process right now. So this is basically trying to calculate the numbers of people in need and then the amount of funding that's required. And I had the chance to sit in on a consultation meeting for this recently, so I was involved on a very limited basis. And I was struck by how, on the one hand, we're in a very data-rich environment here in Ukraine compared to many other contexts. But on the other hand, the constant changing dynamics on the ground, the waves of displacement and movements also make it quite difficult to be sure if these estimates are accurate. And in the mine action sector specifically, because we haven't completed the large scale survey of potentially hazardous areas, we do not know the scale of the problem yet. But these figures, however accurate they are going to be used to determine future funding. So we need to find better solutions to ensure that we're able to keep up the efforts in the long term, because we know that we'll be here for a long time, specifically addressing the threat of landmines, to make sure that all of those items are destroyed. And then lastly, just on resilience, it's now been more than 2.5 years since the start of the full-scale invasion, and people keep going because they have to. But I think it's also worth acknowledging, Ukrainians are living and working with an enormous amount of unprocessed trauma. Many of my coworkers here have lost loved ones. Some have been conscripted into the military. Many have relatives living in the line of fire, or their apartments have been damaged or destroyed. But I think people also are desensitized in some ways to the ongoing risks that they're facing out in the fields, and that's a related but separate thing. And I think to a lesser extent, this also applies to many international staff who have been here for a while as well. And many of us are guilty of ignoring air alert apps on our phones, waking up in the middle of the night to hearing explosions and just rolling over and going back to sleep. But I think it's really important, and what motivates me and keeps me going is getting out to the field as much as possible and remaining focused on the people who are most affected, and who ultimately we're here to serve. So I feel very privileged to be here, and I plan to stay here as long as I can remain to be useful. So I'll stop there, but thank you very much, and looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Rachel. You have our full respect. Also for the long-term perspective that your NGO and yourself have to have in mind. Thank you for reminding us of the very serious security challenges, the funding challenges, as we also observe a certain fatigue in certain Western countries, and the challenge of people on the personal level, unprocessed trauma. I understand that the Ukrainian Catholic University will invest in mental health responses, and the First Lady is behind that. So thank you for sharing. We move now to Taras, whom we have asked to be our military expert. So as a layperson, we just get some impressions of what's happening. How do you judge the current situation from a military perspective, Taras? Thank you. Over to you.
Thank you very much. It's a huge pleasure to be here and to share my inputs with all of you. So it's a challenging task to pack all the war developments in 5-minute speech, but I will try to highlight the most important things which I think are very vital for understanding the current battlefield developments and the current war developments. To start with, I would like to highlight two very important things for all of us to properly understand this war and to properly understand what's going on the battlefield. So the first thing I would like to mention is that this war, this large-scale Russian invasion into Ukraine, which started 2.5 years ago, is not a separate incident. So the actual war that Russia has started against Ukraine dates back to February 2014. And this full-scale assault is just another phase of this war, which Russia is systematically waging against Ukraine. And this war and this Russian strategy is a part of a grand Russian strategic scheme to get back into world geopolitics and to reinstall Russian Federation as a global nuclear superpower, just a kind of USSR 2.0, and to have the Europe redivided into spheres of influence like it used to be during the Cold War. So this is a strategic task which tackles not only Ukraine, but also which targets the Western European countries, United Kingdom, Great Britain, and so on. And the second general thing to remind us all is that this war, despite it's right now waged mostly on the battlefield, this war has never stopped of being hybrid. So it's a hybrid conflict, which includes not only a massive use of military force, but the use of information, psychological operations, disinformation, all the various hybrid toolkit which Russia has in its shop, and it's directed not only against Ukraine, but it also is directed against the North Atlantic Treaty Alliance, as we clearly are seeing right now. So having these two things in mind, I'd like to move on to analyze what's happening on the battlefield, and I've divided my analysis into three geographical dimensions, which are very closely interconnected between each other and which represent different directions and different geographical sectors of the battlefield. So the first and the most dire judging on the situation on the ground, the first dimension is the eastern sector of the battlefield, the eastern sector of the front, and it's the Donetsk region of Ukraine and the northern part of Luhansk region of Ukraine. So the most fierce battles are waged right now on this very direction, and Russia utilizes its own advantages there. So we should keep in mind that Russian generals are fighting with numbers. So they are relying on the quantity and not on the quality of their forces. And it goes well with the manpower they try to find and push against Ukrainian defenders. And it goes along with the firepower, which Russia also tries to amass against the Ukrainian armed forces. And due to the fact that Ukraine has a very large land border with Russian Federation on the eastern part of the country, Russia utilizes this geography to amass forces there as much as they can. And this makes the situation on the Eastern Front very dire, and Russians are trying to push the most pressure on that very part of the battlefield. Moving on to the southern sector of the front, to the southern sector of the battlefield, it's the Zaporizhia and Kherson regions of Ukraine, and the parts of these regions which are currently occupied by Russian forces, and also the Russian-occupied Ukrainian Crimea. This is one of the strategic parts for Russian offensive in general, and one of the most sensitive in the political terms for the Kremlin, because it all has started in Crimea in 2014, and eventually it would end in Crimea sometime later, as we are speaking right now. This part is very vulnerable for Russia to defend, because unlike the eastern sector of the front, it doesn't have the luxury of geography for the Russians to try to somehow use this as advantage and to improvise and to try to hide their logistics from Ukrainian strikes. And this is one of the key strategic directions towards which Ukrainian armed forces are trying to use the most efficient firepower they have. Because if we reach a strategic goal of trying to separate in the military terms Crimea from the Russian Federation, try to deny Russian military any access to Crimea, this would be one of the keys to the victory in this war in general. Unlike the Eastern Front, which is a stalemate, as General Zaluzhny has put it, the southern sector of the battlefield is more advantageous to Ukrainian armed forces. So we have enough firepower and enough range of this firepower to pound Russian military targets all across the Crimean Peninsula, and putting immense pressure on the Russian military there. And this means that from the logistical point of view, Russian occupiers on the southern regions of continental Ukraine doesn't have all the resources they need to fight. But nevertheless, we needed something more. We needed some strategic initiative in our hand, and this moves us to the third geographical dimension of my analysis, the Kursk operation. Kursk operation is, from the strategic point of view, it's a win situation for Ukraine, because first of all, it draws resources from the eastern and southern flanks of Russian military alliance in Ukraine to try to defend the Kursk region. Russia tries to amass there something from 45 to 60,000 troops and additional military equipment. And that means that these 45 to 60,000 Russian troops won't go to Ukraine. They won't fight on Ukrainian territory. And that means that Ukrainian defenders, at least in the eastern sector of the front line, would have a much easier job to do to try to stop Russian invasion. And also, Kursk operation puts immense political pressure on Putin's regime, as it shows that Russian security institutions are simply they are simply not able to defend their own territory, to preserve their own territorial integrity. And what's more, Ukrainian commanders are trying to employ, first of all, the Russian hybrid tactics against them on the Russian soil, which leaves Russian military practically defenseless against these tactics. And also, Ukrainian armed forces are trying to employ the NATO military strategies of maneuver warfare there. And this is something that Russian army is incapable of dealing with, because as they are used to amassing their forces, they need some stationary defense lines to pound into the ground. But we are denying them this, and we are waging
Taras, you are at
warfare.
minute 8. Sorry.
Yeah, one minute for conclusions. To develop this Kursk operation into success and to give us the more instruments to put pressure on Putin's regime, not only in Kursk, but also in Ukraine and Crimea, we actually need that courage of our Western allies, which all have mentioned. So we need that courage to allow us to strike to the old down through the deep of Russian territory to destroy their military installations there. And then this could be an entry point for a political resolution of this war. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Taras, also for reminding us of the war did not start in February 2022, but we go far further back, at least to spring 2014, as part of a grander Russian scheme. Thank you for reminding us of the hybrid nature of the war, and thank you for analysis of East, South, and the Kursk region, and also connecting what Olya said with your own analysis of the situation. Thank you, and Mary Ellen, if I may please hand over to you, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Clemens. Just a year ago, I was in Lviv. I was at the Ukrainian Catholic University, and I was lecturing to amazing international law students from all over Ukraine about the law against war, the prohibition on the use of force that we have enshrined in the United Nations Charter, that we have received as a common human family from ancient wisdom. And it could not be more important that this principle emerge from this terrible war triumphant, that we learn new respect for the prohibition on the use of force. And I told the students, I believe that Ukraine's struggle is the key factor that will lead to an era in which we have a real chance of building order under law, or to a period of real chaos if Ukraine is defeated, if Ukraine has to negotiate for something less than its complete boundaries as determined by international law. And those were the boundaries it took into the United Nations in 1991. My further view, and what I also emphasize to the students, is that it's really the duty of countries, I would say in particular the United States, but also all of the US's NATO allies, to support Ukraine until it succeeds. I told them about the long history of the United States, certainly since the end of the Cold War, as the Soviet Union declined, of US arrogance. Instead of leading from the principles of true international law, there was an arrogance in which the United States thought it could dictate its own preferences for the prohibition on the use of force and related norms. As a result, we saw that the rest of the world began to view these core principles with less respect. If this one country could dictate what the content actually was, why shouldn't other countries, especially countries that had major militaries like Russia, like Iran, why couldn't they dictate their own rules? And so we saw one of the most unique and grievous violations of the UN Charter, first in 2014, but even worse in 2022. In fact, when Russia invaded Ukraine, attempting to conquer its neighbor, this was only the second time since the Second World War, since 1945, that one state has attempted to conquer a United Nations member. The other time was when Iraq invaded Kuwait in 1990. The difference was, at that time, the norm against conquest, the norm against violating the prohibition on the use of force in the Charter was still robust. The whole world came together to defend Kuwait. Compare that to, yes, there was good support for Ukraine at the beginning, but nothing like what Kuwait got. And now we see it waning. So this really changes the situation for Ukraine. We should, the moral onus is on the West that helped undermine this rule to support Ukraine and rebuild the rule, reinstate and enforce it against Russia and its aggression. But we see these many political factors that are pulling in another direction. And so that leads me to talk about 2 points that I'd rather not have to talk about. I'd rather be saying, this is great. Yes, it's going to take longer than anyone hoped, but don't forget, Poland needed 6 years before it was liberated from the Nazi invasion of 1939. So this is not so long in the scheme of these kinds of aggressions, but we have to take into account what the other political factors are when we're trying to figure out how Ukraine emerges in the most successful way from this terrible situation. So that leads me to 2 main points. One about the way Ukraine is conducting its self-defense operation, and the second about the looming United States elections and what that could possibly mean for Ukraine going forward. We have to talk about this honestly. So the first point, we have the basic prohibition on the use of force in the Charter. It says the use of military force, armed force, is prohibited. It's just clear. And then there are 2 limits for self-defense and for authorization of the Security Council. Ukraine has that right of self-defense. There is no doubt. In my view, Ukraine is the only country in the world that is lawfully using military force under the limitation for self-defense in Article 51 of the UN Charter. But there's a further limitation on Ukraine carrying out that defense lawfully. And as I stated at the beginning, if Ukraine is fighting, and I will take up Taras's point, that the West has to have courage and support Ukraine. Ukraine's best chance of maintaining that support, come what may in the political sphere, is to constantly refer to its use of force as consistent with international law. There are 2 more principles that it has to comply with. Every use of force, the whole design of its strategy for self-defense must respect the principle of necessity. Everything it does, all the war that it wages, has to be carefully calibrated to what's needed to expel Russian forces from its territory. So that leads to the question, was the extension into Kursk really tied to that necessity? Was it carefully enough tied? I believe in giving the presumption or the benefit of the doubt to the state that has been the victim of the armed attack, but still, that point is taken. So I think maybe Taras made that case that it can never be political, Taras. It has to be military. Second, what about the long-range weapons? Everything that can be done to expel Russian forces, all of that support needs to be given to Ukraine. But there has to be a careful calculation about long-term missiles and jet aircraft. That has to be tied to this strategy of what will effectively excel. No drones on Moscow. That's not effectively going to expel a single soldier from Ukraine. So that's been unfortunate. And for political reasons, that doesn't count. I know I'm getting short on time, so I'll just fast forward to the elections that are coming up. It's incumbent on Ukraine to be nimble, to figure out what it's going to do if Donald Trump is elected. We all know that he does not want to continue to support Ukraine. It's going to be a tough decision. Maybe there is a way to negotiate. One of the things I believe was a mistake about Kursk was that the energy agreement that was just about to be brokered in Qatar was demolished. There have to be other ways that Ukraine, in the face of it has to be planning this now, a Trump victory can still, under international law, it never loses its territory so long as it resists. But does it have the people and material to continue the fight at this level? Is there another way through partial negotiations of autonomous regions or so forth that preserves Ukraine as best as possible?
Mary Ellen, thank you so much. Also for reminding us that international law is relevant also for self-defense, and that there may be some complicated questions about the current situation. Thank you also for bringing up the core principles of international order, where the moral onus is on the West, just to defend, because erosions will have, as you said, chaos, not only in Ukraine, but all over the world. Thank you, Mary Ellen. And now we need a sober philosophical voice in the person of Volodymyr. If I may hand over to you, Volodymyr, floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. It's both pleasure and honor to be part of this conversation. And let me begin by sharing our most recent UKU experience and then highlighting a few intuitions. Opening of the academic year at UKU was going to be a fine and special event this year. It aimed at celebrating our academic achievements, sharing our hopes, plans, and visions for the new year, and of course, welcoming our new students. Yet it turned out to be marked by some very tragic and saddening events. Two of our community's members were killed by Russians, and their deaths have profoundly touched and shaken everyone on campus. On August 27th, Mykola Hayovy was killed at the front lines of Kursk region. Mykola was our PhD student, a gifted historian who volunteered in the army, planning to finish his PhD studies after the victory. On September 4th, Daria Bazalevich, a second-year student of the Cultural Studies program at our Faculty of Humanities, was killed by a Russian missile attack on Lviv. Here is a quote from Daria's motivational letter for the UKU scholarship, wherein she explains that she chose cultural studies because I'm a very creative person, interested in the culture and history of my country and in the future. I want to develop Ukrainian culture and share it with the world. This passion arose in me thanks to my family, who always shared stories with me about the trials our ancestors went through due to the world wars, the Holodomor, and the Soviet Union. Daria is not with us anymore. She was killed by a Russian missile that hit the building where she lived with her family in Lviv downtown. Daria's mother and her two sisters were killed in that deadly hit. Only their father survived. A few days later, he buried his family, followed and supported by the hundreds of our university community members and by thousands of Lviv citizens who participated in the funeral. Daria, I believe, was 8 years old when the Russian Federation annexed Crimea and invaded the eastern regions of Ukraine in 2014. The words I just quoted, she most likely wrote after February 2022 full-fledged escalation by the Russians. She made her final decision to get her university degree in Ukraine at the time of the war, with its daily air raid alarms and no visible closure at hand. So what is Ukraine these days? Ukraine is many things these days. Ukraine is a battlefield, a moral ground, an open wound, a genocidal abyss, a place of conversion and martyrdom, a solidarity hub, a recovery and innovation site, a field hospital, and a social transformation lab. And it's also a source of courage, faith, hope, and vision for the future. It sounds very perplexing, but so the reality is we are living in. I'd like to draw a few intuitions that I believe this image of Ukraine conveys. Russia is waging a war of aggression against Ukraine with a genocidal intent as its core motivation. Its current plan is to occupy the maximum possible territory of Ukraine, to dehumanize Ukrainian people under occupation, while consistently attempting to turn Ukraine into an infrastructural desert, and thus to deprive Ukraine of the possibility of development for the next 10, 15 years, at least. Well, genocidal intent and practice make its impact felt in a significant way. Ukraine has become the country with the highest death rate in the world and the lowest birth rate, according to the latest 2024 data reports from the CIA on global mortality and birth rates. I believe Ukraine's primary strategy is twofold. A, defend itself and gradually liberate its occupied territories, and B, develop the capacity and resilience needed for sustained self-protection over the next 10, 20 years or more. In short, Ukraine should aim to create a robust, multifaceted, and hybrid defense against ongoing and future threats, ensuring its long-term survival, recovery, and eventual just peace. This capacity building effort encompasses multiple dimensions, practically spanning everything any country should focus on. However, Ukraine is at war, which implies a huge deficit of security and an immense need for tangible and intangible resources. By intangible, I'm referring to things such as institutional and community resilience and ethical infrastructure. While I consider hope to be the most important indicator when the future is at stake, I want to share two findings from a recent national-wide survey in Ukraine. When asked what feelings arise in you when you think about the future of Ukraine, the Ukrainians marked hope 61% as their prevailing feeling, followed by anxiety 40% and optimism 3.5%. Hope transcends strategies, roadmaps, and deadlines. It's about the understanding that we are all cared for, remembered, and loved in the shared quest for the greater common good. Hope rests in believing that no one will be left behind, abandoned, or betrayed. Do you know what I admire in my fellow Ukrainians and what makes me proud? Hope I was just referring to is baked up by their actions and deeds. It is far more powerful than just a feeling. It is an act in hope. The absolute majority of Ukrainians, 71%, have been involved in volunteer assistance to the army, temporarily displaced persons, or people affected by the war since the beginning of the full-scale invasion. Their hope serves, saves, embraces, feeds, warms, heals, upholds, sacrifices, connects, brings joy, and consoles. This is reinforced by the recent findings of the World Giving Index report, which compiled 13 years of data collection. According to their analysis, Ukraine became the second most charitable country in the world over this 13 years. I conclude by referring to Timothy Snyder. In one of his texts, he reminds us of what makes democracies vulnerable. The vulnerability arises from forgetting the organic connection of democracy to ethical commitment and physical courage. This is why Snyder is convinced that, quote, Ukrainian resistance to what appeared to be overwhelming force reminded the world that democracy is not about accepting the apparent verdict of history. It is about making history, striving towards human values despite the way of empire, oligarchy, and propaganda, and in so doing, revealing previously unseen possibilities, end quote. Yes, indeed, history in the future is in the making in Ukraine, and it takes ethical commitment, courage, sacrifice, vision, and hope for the many to proceed. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Volodymyr, also for reminding us of this important topic of hope. As you know, Notre Dame will organize an inaugural conference of our Ukrainian Studies Hub on this very topic. Thank you for reminding us of the connection between democracy, ethics, and physical courage, and the twofold strategy of Ukraine to defend, but also to sustain its self-protection. We have questions coming in. I have 5 so far and already apologize to the audience if we do not get to all of them. I will direct them to our esteemed panelists and would ask them to please be brief. We all know you're brilliant, you can so much more, but one way of showing your brilliance is to be brief and precise. Mary Ellen, if I may direct the first question to you about maximalism. You said that it would remain a violation of international law if Ukraine does not get its territory back from 1991. At the same time, this looks improbable. So if there are negotiations where there's certain compromise on the territory in a non-maximalized way, what would that mean for the future of our international order and its perception?
That is a very subtle question that would need a lot of time. So I'm going to try to be very brief, but I really appreciate the subtlety and the nuance that would be required to truly answer this. There are other models of places where people have resisted for many years and many decades any legal crystallization. Under international law, only when a state gives free consent to a change of its territorial sovereignty does that have any real validity. So we've got examples. We've got internal examples such as South Africa resisting minority rule. We have the example of the Palestinian people who have resisted for so long, I'm sorry, not always peacefully, for their homeland. So we have examples of long-running, and even if Ukraine were to create zones where ongoing armed conflict were not happening, it could preserve its legal right to these territories and continue a form of protest to prevent crystallization of any Russian incursion. Russia could delude itself into thinking that it now has sovereignty. We've seen examples of this too, but this might be one way in the event that Donald Trump cuts off the absolute necessary munitions. I mean, we all know Ukraine is dependent on the US providing munitions. So if that happens, it may be time for some really deft diplomacy, which I know Ukrainian diplomats are capable of, with the advice of truly expert international lawyers. There are a lot of people running around today saying that they know international law. They don't have the case studies and the deep knowledge that would be required for this. So that's my temporary answer.
Thank you, Mary Ellen. Taras, may I please turn to you? And the question is, in the light of Mary Ellen's reminder of the constraints under which even self-defense has to operate given international law, do you expect that Ukraine can continue to respect that, or will we move more and more into a gray zone?
Well, I think we would try our best to uphold the international law and the rules of law which regulate the wartime experience and the wartime developments. First of all, we are fighting for our security. So our ultimate goal is to make sure that Russia doesn't have its own military infrastructure to continue to preserve a threat to Ukrainian sovereignty and to Ukrainian people. So we do not want to wipe out the Russian Federation as a country. We are not seeking wiping out the Russian citizens. So we are striking precisely the targets which have direct connection to Russian military-industrial complex or to Russian military or the Russian military installations which support the Russian war efforts in Ukrainian territory. So this is number one priority, and the next point I would like to highlight here in my answer is that eventually we are seeking to be a NATO member and to be an official part of the community of Western nations. So it simply doesn't fit for our philosophy, for our strategy to go along with what Russia is doing and to simply copying the Russian practices, which definitely have all signs of genocide. But Russia uses them to their own political strategic goals, and our political strategic goals are completely different from that.
Thank you, Taras. A question to Olya, if I may. The question is this. Increasingly, Ukraine has developed domestic long-range drone systems that it has been using to launch strikes deep in Russian territory. At first, these targeted mostly Russian oil refineries. Recently, some drones have hit Russian apartment buildings. How do Ukrainians feel about these instances, given the scale and intensity of Russian bombing against Ukrainian residential areas? Do you have any wisdom on that? How do Ukrainians feel about the Ukrainian attacks on Russian territory? Olya.
Well, Ukrainians, well, I haven't seen any polls on that, but what I hear and what we hear, for example, in interviews or what people talk to us as journalists, for example, is that Ukraine needs to strike what it needs for military purposes. So mainly oil refineries were the target we needed to strike in order to keep Russia from attacking us or from serving this oil its military. So what had happened with the residential buildings is, of course, not what Ukrainians want, and I think the still feelings of sadness and then sympathy, they are still present. So I mean, for Ukrainians, we like as Taras said, we have different purposes in this war. In this war, Ukraine needs to liberate its territory, and for that, of course, it needs to attack military or industrial objects in Russia and not residential buildings. Yes, Taras.
Taras, ad hoc, brief.
Yes, very briefly. Just to add some military technical details to what Olya has said. Russia is deploying its surface-to-air missile systems within the residential areas. So this is a clear violation of one of the points of the international law and international law of war, and this causes the drones to be shot down above the residential areas, and the debris, of course, is falling down. But we are sure that Russian military commanders don't care about their civilians and their lives.
Thank you, Taras. A question for Rachel. If I may say so, you are close to the ground and young in age. And the question is, what are there plans to retain youth? And what about the brain drain? What do you observe when it comes to, think about the long-term future of Ukraine and so many, young people having left the country with their mothers especially. How do you see that from the future of from the perspective of Ukraine's future?
Well, so I think from the perspective of an implementing organization here in Ukraine, there are definitely challenges with hiring and retaining staff. One of the big challenges is actually military conscription. And actually in the mine action sector, there's been a lot of developments recently trying to get deminers and people involved in that part of the response exempt from conscription, considering that they're contributing to the security of Ukraine from that side of things. In terms of the brain drain, that is something that we definitely face. Men are not permitted to exit the country, but there's a great amount of demand for their labor resources, if we put it crudely in those terms. And then often when seeking to hire, for example, subject matter experts, like in Halo, we were recently looking to hire a gender and inclusion expert. Many of these people have emigrated or frankly are working for UN agencies that can afford to pay much more than a small humanitarian organization can, relatively speaking. So it is definitely a concern, but I think it's really inspiring to see Ukrainian youth who are so motivated to help their country. And beyond employment, I'm also seeing so many Ukrainians are really active, as was alluded to previously, in volunteering. So I think just the civic activism in all sectors of society is really.
You also answered the second question, which was about what about workers needed for essential services and men conscripted to the army? You kind of alluded to that. Volodymyr, you can also comment on the youth and the question of how to retain youth. But there's also an explicit question about what can American universities do to collaborate with Ukrainian universities?
Well, I have a very good example in mind, and that's the partnership that we have with the University of Notre Dame, as a matter of fact. And I think it would be fantastic if other American universities, and I think that many do, would kind of follow that example. And in 2022, that was just a few months after Russia escalated and invaded full-fledgedly Ukraine. University of Notre Dame announced its partnership program, Standing in Solidarity, a partnership program with the Ukrainian Catholic University. And from my view, that was the excellent move. As I indicated in my kind of presentation, Ukraine, it's a land, it's a huge open air social lab, if I can put it this way, with all kind of tragedy embedded in. But on the other hand, we need American universities' expertise somehow just to be able to see, to monitor, to collect data, to think about the future. Somehow, I do believe that what's going on in Ukraine, let me use Timothy Snyder's words again. I think he used to say that where Ukraine has, the world is going in a way. So somehow, it's the right place and time to be with Ukraine, and also academically. We mentioned militarily, diplomatically, any other ways, and this is very much appreciated and mostly needed. But also, I think academically, it's time and place to be with Ukraine, and this would be the way somehow just to move in developing, say, research project.
Thank you, Volodymyr.
Online.
So turn to the Nanovic Institute if you want to get some examples of this collaboration, friends. We have 4 minutes left, which means I can give 30 seconds to each of our panelists. I already apologize to friends in the audience that we will not get to their questions. I will start with Mary Ellen. You have 30 seconds. You can say whatever you want as your closing statement, but there is one question open, which is, what are the prospects for peace negotiations following the Summit on Peace in Switzerland? 30 seconds.
We have to continue with these sort of initiatives. There's no question. Regardless, and believe me, there's a different prospect. I just had a complaint from a friend. It's not a foregone conclusion that Donald Trump will become the next president. I just want people to be prepared. That's what lawyers advise their clients to do. If things go well, then the peace negotiations, this then shifts the dynamic so dramatically. If there's a commitment by a future Harris administration, then the Russians have to start thinking, how much longer can they go on? If Harris can bring together this worldwide coalition, which till now has been lagging, and really commit to international law as it's written, and not this arrogant version, she could build that diplomatic coalition that makes it clear to the Russians. If she could get the Indians, if she could get the Chinese pulled off, this is a recipe for success without needing to lose more Ukrainian lives.
Thank you, Mary Ellen. Olya, 30 seconds, a closing statement, whatever you want to give us on our way.
Well, I would stress once more on what I said in my input statement on the courage, and thank you for Professor Marianne O'Connell that you mentioned so much commitment to the international law. I think this is also the part of courage we need to have now, so that to support Ukraine and so that we could win finally this war and liberate the territories, and so that Ukraine can go back to the territory it had in 1991, and finally then we can talk about the peace, because we need just peace, and that is important. Not just peace, not the peace can think about, but the just one.
Not just negative peace, but just peace. Thank you, Olya. Taras, 30 seconds, whatever you want to give us on our way.
Thank you very much. I'll get back to the issue of political resolution of this war. And I would like to stress that this political resolution is built on the battlefield. It's a war, actually, and the negotiations positions are shaped on the battlefield. And the just peace means that Ukraine has all capabilities, all the capacity, and all the tools to secure its future in both a political and military way. So there's not going to be any effective and efficient political resolution without taking into account that Russia understands only strength and power. And so this is the formula, that peace through power. Thank you.
Peace through power. Thank you, Taras. Rachel, 30 seconds.
No pressure. I think Ukraine is a really important case for humanitarian response, learning the lessons of previous interventions so we can avoid repeating mistakes here, and trialing innovative practices and programming that can be used elsewhere. And so I think as much as we all want this war to end soon and with a decisive Ukrainian victory, we need to dig in for the long haul and bring innovative solutions.
Thank you, Rachel. And you're a great example of a person who is there in solidarity with Ukraine. We're very proud of you, if I may say so. Vladimir, 28 seconds.
Yeah, I think hope is very important, and I'm happy to see that hope among Ukrainians, and I do believe that hope is also what our international community is needed. And I just want to remind us all that we are in kind of very long-term extended processes, and 10-year war, which we are a part of, it certainly required 20 or 30 years of preparations on the part of the aggressor. So there's a long way ahead of us, and hope will kind of lead us through that.
Thank you. Peace through power and peace through hope. That's my takeaway. We are at time. We want to thank our esteemed panelists for their wisdom and their participation. Thank you, Olya, Rachel, Taras, Mary Ellen, and Volodymyr. We want to thank the audience for their interest and your questions. We want to thank our colleagues who made this panel possible, especially Tim Jackley, Grant Osborne, Keith Sayers, and Becca Prince. My final word: on the day of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, our university president, new president emeritus, Father John Jenkins, has issued a statement where he said, "Our friends in Ukraine are in need of healing and hope. We at Notre Dame stand in solidarity with all peace-loving people worldwide in demanding an end to this invasion of a sovereign nation. This unprovoked war is an international abomination and must stop now. Until it does, may God keep safe all of the innocent men, women, and children who are currently in harm's way. The prayers of the Notre Dame family are with them." With these prayers for peace for Ukraine and for the world, we from the Nanovic Institute for European Studies want to wish you all a good and safe afternoon. Peace to Ukraine. Thank you so much.